But thank you all for being here. It's my second time at this event. Had a blast last year. Show of hands, how many folks are here from last year as well? Okay, great. So some of the stuff that you hear me say might have overlap over last year. Don't go give away the punchline or steal my thunder. I want to start by thanking Angela again for putting together an amazing event. These things, round of applause for her. These things are a labor of love, and they take immense time and toil and sacrifice and investment, and a lot of stuff is kind of beneath the surface that you don't see. It's like that joke whenever guests come over, you throw everything like under the covers or inside of something larger so it looks clean, but we all know where the mess is. So I want to thank you for all the work you've done here. My name is Qasim Rashid. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I want to talk about what Olivia introduced me as, but also on a broader narrative about the importance of the framing that we bring to the table right now. There's this mantra that we're living in unprecedented times, and I want to reject that narrative altogether. We are actually, unfortunately, living in very precedented times. And part of the disinformation campaign out there is to convince you that this is unprecedented, so you don't know what to do. And the reality is this is extraordinarily precedented. We're going to talk about three aspects: the past, the present, and the future. And this conversation is going to be uncomfortable. And I say that not as a threat, but as context, as a trigger warning that there are moments where we're going to have uncomfortable conversations. If you feel that, hey, this is not for me, I won't be offended if you feel like we got to step out for a minute. But my view is we're all here in a place of safety and protection, and we're all going to assume positive intent from one another. We're going to have a very genuine and transparent conversation. I'm going to be speaking. I'm going to be asking you guys to be involved as well. You can be involved as much or as little as you'd like. But let me start with a story that kind of put me on the path of how I've gotten here, standing before you today as well. And this story begins when I was about to graduate law school. Geez, now almost 16 years ago. And this was around 2010, 2011, where for those of you who are lawyers or have people in the legal industry, you know this was a very difficult time in the legal industry. We were still coming out of the recession. There was still a lot of uncertainty. Law firms weren't really hiring. And so here I am, finishing up law school, had a phenomenal internship at one of the top law firms in Richmond, Virginia, where I was at the time. And I got the best news of my life. The law firm said they were going to make me an offer. And I was a non-traditional law student. I finished undergrad, worked for a couple of years, got married. My wife and I had our first kid. And when he was 6 months old, I started law school. And so here I am, getting ready to graduate. And I've got a wonderful wife and a rambunctious 2-year-old, and in a terrible economy, I get this awesome news. And me being the naive fool that I am, as other law firms called for interviews or offers, I said, no, I already have an offer. I don't need your money anymore. I already have the offer I want. One of the dumbest mistakes I've ever made, but hindsight is 20/20. Well, a month passes, and I don't get the follow-up. 2 months pass, and I call them and say, don't worry, it's coming. 3 months pass, and they say, we've changed our mind, we're not going to make you an offer. So I call back all the other law firms, and they laugh at me. Like, are you kidding? No, you're gone. And here I'm left wondering what in the world just happened. How did I go from having an offer from a firm that was my dream job to being out in the cold months before graduation and no prospect of how I'm going to provide for my family? The partner that I work with at the law firm calls me and says, hey, can we get lunch together? Now, my instinct was, no, I don't want to get lunch with you. The better angels got me to say yes, and I find myself at this very awkward conversation outside of this coffee shop in Richmond, right in downtown. And we're talking, making small talk, basic conversations that you have with somebody that you don't want to be around. And I want to be around him. Because this is the guy who told me we're going to make you the offer, so we want you to turn down other offers because we want to be able to have first dibs. And we're sitting and he goes, listen, I'm just going to be honest with you. As we thought more about the offer, we live in a very weird time in our country right now. Some of you may remember this, in 2011, and it's reviving now, there's this massive anti-Sharia movement happening in the country. And it's reviving. In fact, today they're having anti-Sharia hearings on Capitol Hill. 30-some states have introduced laws to ban Muslims and to ban Sharia law. This is when our current president was starting his racist birther movement, and it was kind of sweeping the country. And for black and brown people, for immigrants, it was another revival of the history of this country. And so he goes, in this time, it's going to be difficult to talk to our conservative client base and explain to them why a brown Muslim immigrant is representing them in these cases. And then he followed it up by saying, if you ever attribute this to me publicly, I'll deny it. So don't even try. Now, for the folks who might immediately be thinking this is probably a right-wing, conservative, MAGA didn't exist at the time, but he's probably a very strong right-wing conservative. This guy is a major donor to the Democratic Party, and he was a partner that led the Employment Discrimination Division at this firm. Puts things into perspective, doesn't it? And then he follows up with me and says, but look, if you're willing to delete your social media, I had a decent following of about 10,000 followers on social media. If you're willing to shave the beard, stop with all the Muslim stuff, maybe we can talk to the firm again and come back to you in a couple of months. I'm going to come back to the story in a minute, but put yourself in my shoes, right? You've got a 6-figure offer waiting for you, and for someone who grew up in Section 8 housing and on food stamps, a 6-figure offer might as well have been an 8-figure offer. More money than I've ever seen in my life. For somebody who didn't have health care throughout law school, having health care was an option that I hadn't dreamed of before. For someone who wanted to have a larger family, all these things are coming into mind. I'm going to come back to the story in a second. And the reason why I want to pause there is because I want to talk about the framing aspect of all this. Because the framing changes everything. However we talk about any conversation, the framing is what we need to think about. So let me start with a couple of questions, and I want you guys, by a show of hands, to tell me what year do you think this was true? And I'm going to give you 3 years. 1750, 1850, or 1950. Okay? I'm going to give you a statistic, and you're going to raise your hands by telling me what year it was. Okay, the first statistic is this. 98% of land in this country is owned by white people. If you think that was 1750, raise your hand. If you think that was 1850, raise your hand. If you think that was 1950, raise your hand. Okay. Most people think it's 1950. Okay. Second statistic. The median wealth of a white family is 40 times that of a black family and 30 times that of a Latino family. Was that 1750? Raise your hand. 1850? 1950. Okay, 1950. Criminal justice system. That at least 1 in 3 women suffer sexual assault at some point in their life, and more than 98% of men who commit rape never see a day in prison. Was that 1750, 1850, or 1950? Okay. Or all of them? Every single one? This framing is important because I gave you a framing of 1750, 1850, and 1950, and all of you accepted that framing. The actual answer is that all 3 of those are wrong answers. That's the current reality in 2026 America. White people own 98% of land. The median wealth of a white family is 40 times that of a black family, 30 times that of a Latino family. And according to RAIN, which is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, more than 98% of men who commit rape will never see a day in prison. This is the current reality right now. And again, I start this not to deceive you or to create distrust, but just to emphasize this point that so many of the problems that we see in society right now, whether they're in the workplace, whether they're in politics, whether they're in a community environment, is because the framing is one that is inaccurate, but we've already accepted it. And so as we talk about these conversations, as you talk about the struggles that you're going through right now to build to the next level, one of the first questions that you need to force yourself, and it's a very uncomfortable question, is what is the framing that I've adopted, and is it the accurate way to look at this problem in the first place? And so I want to look at history to give some examples of people who rejected the framing and the results that came from it. Who here has heard of Elizabeth Freeman before? Okay, you're going to love this story. Elizabeth Freeman was an enslaved black woman in Massachusetts. And a century before the Civil War, she successfully sued for her freedom. A concept that was completely alien unknown at the time. Elizabeth Freeman recognized that Massachusetts had passed a new state constitution that said that all people are created equal. And she said, hold up, how are all people created equal and I'm still sitting here as an enslaved person? So she solicited the help of a white lawyer, an ally, who put his law license and legal practice on the line for her, that partnership mattered, and she sued for her freedom. And because she sued for her freedom and fought and went to the Supreme Court and won, Massachusetts became one of the first states to abolish slavery permanently throughout the entire state. She did this a century before the Civil War. She looked at the framing that black people are enslaved and looked at the Constitution that said all people are free and said, hold on a second, something doesn't add up. Most people bought into the idea that black people, because they're enslaved, did not qualify for the Constitution, and she rejected that framing. And because of her, literally millions of people were able to gain their freedom as well. And this is an example of why just because the law says something doesn't mean it's moral or just. Legality is a function of power. It's not a function of morality. Legality is a function of authority. It's not a function of justice. So that framing matters. Another story I love. Who here has heard of Robert Smalls? Okay, one person, I love it. This is another example of how framing changes everything. So Robert Smalls was born in the 1830s, late 1830s, early 1840s. And he was born into an enslaved family, a black man born into an enslaved family. When he was about 20 or 21, he convinced his enslaver to let him go to the shores of South Carolina and learn maritime law, learn how to operate boats and vessels and fishermen and all the stuff that people do on water. And the enslaver let him, so he went, he learned these skills, he got married, had a family as an enslaved person. And while all this time, the enslaver thought, I'm just getting a skilled fisherman to enslave, Robert Smalls had a different perspective. His plan was to escape. And so over a planning of several months, some historians think over several years, he built alliances, he built trusts and friendships, and one night, he convinced his enslaver to let him manage the boat entirely. And on that night, he coordinated with his friends and his allies and his wife and children to pick them up. He had learned all the secret codes of the Confederacy during the Civil War. He disguised himself, and he successfully navigated the ship out of Confederate waters into Union waters. Now, if he had stopped there, that would be a pretty remarkable story, but that's where he was just getting started. He then went to President Lincoln and said, hey, this whole framing you have that black people can't fight in the Union Army is wrong. You need to let us fight for our own freedom as well. And because of Robert Smalls, 5,000 black Americans enlisted in the Union Army and single-handedly helped turn the tide of the Civil War. And he was elevated to captain. So we talk about Captain America. My dream is to have a Captain America movie with Captain Robert Smalls, because that was his rank. And if he stopped there and helped win the Civil War, that would be a remarkable story, but he didn't stop there. He went back to South Carolina and became one of the first black Americans elected to the South Carolina state legislature. And he established the public school system in South Carolina. And so the sheer irony today is, as we're seeing states like South Carolina ban black history, they're literally banning the very man who established the public education system in the first place. And he didn't stop there either. After getting elected to the state legislature, he was one of the first black Americans elected to US Congress. And what's beautiful about this story, the ultimate flex that I think about, is he gained enough wealth to then go back to the home of the man who enslaved him and purchase the home of enslaver. That's a flex. And then he had the compassion and the wherewithal to let the enslaver's family live there. The enslaver had died, he let his family live there. That's the kind of compassion that this man showed. And again, this was an example of somebody who saw the framing for what it was, rejected the framing altogether, broke the law, absolutely broke the law, and said, I'm not going to tolerate this injustice. I'm going to change the framing, change the narrative. He's literally changed American history as a result of it. You can literally pinpoint him convincing Lincoln to let black people fight in the Union Army as a turning point in the Civil War. Around that same time was another remarkable young man, an immigrant named Private Muhammad Khan. Who has heard of Private Muhammad Khan? I'm loving this, all right, great. You guys have new knowledge. So Private Muhammad Khan was an Iranian, what we would now call Iran, or Afghan immigrant. And he arrived in the United States in January 1861. As we know, the Civil War broke out in April of 1861. And he arrived just a few months in New York before the Civil War started. And so now imagine you're an immigrant to this country. Your complexion is like mine. You're not black, you're not white. There's not really very many people of your skin tone in this country in the first place, your complexion. And suddenly this country breaks out into civil war. The logical thing would be to keep your head down, go hide in some corner, let this thing blow over. But Muhammad Khan said, no, I'm going to reject that framing of cowardice. I'm here, I'm in my country, I'm going to serve my country. He enlists in the Union Army. And he serves as a cook for a short while until the very famous Battle of Gettysburg happens. And now the story gets really exciting. He fights in the Battle of Gettysburg and he gets separated from his unit. And he gets picked up by military police. And he insists to the Union military police that I am a Union soldier. And they ask him which infantry. He tells them, say, that's an all-white infantry. You may not be black, but you're definitely not white. And so they consider him a spy or somebody who's there to harm the army, so they put him into military prison. Now here he is doing his best to serve his country, to fight to win the Civil War, and now he finds himself in prison in Philadelphia. And he could have given up, said, look, I could have, I gave my best shot, they don't want me, so I'm just going to hang out here until the Civil War ends. But he says, no, I have a duty or an oath and obligation, and so I'm going to break the law. And so he befriends the other people in the prison camp. And this is a powerful story. Again, we need this movie where he times his escape with the exact moment that the train is pulling out of Philadelphia station. Because he hears there's going to be another battle with his infantry in Spotsylville, Pennsylvania, which is about 70 miles south of DC. He times his escape so that he runs, leaves the prison camp just as the train is pulling out of Philadelphia station and jumps on the train just as it's going fast enough that people on foot can no longer capture him. And with nothing but the clothes on his back, rides this train down to DC and then walks 70 miles by foot to the Battle of the Wilderness in Virginia, arrives at the last day of the battle and finds his unit once more. Both sides are thrilled to see one another. 15 minutes into the battle, he gets shot. And at that point in time, he could have said, all right, I've really given it my all. I can quit now. But he rejects the framing. He rejects the narrative. He goes to a medical hospital, gets healed, and he comes back as a sharpshooter and finishes serving out his time in the Civil War. He's one of 2 Muslim Civil War soldiers who gets a full pension, and his burial plot is in Manhattan right now. He died in 1905. Powerful, amazing story of a person who saw the narrative and the framing and rejected it and said, no, we need to demand better. And I bring up three examples in particular, an example of a black woman, of a black enslaved man, and of an immigrant. All 3 who are today pretty heavily attacked from every angle. And I bring up these examples to go back to what I said earlier, that we are not living in unprecedented times. We are unfortunately living in very precedented times, and they give us the example of how to overcome. And right now, in this culture of advancing white narcissism, I don't like calling it white supremacy, I like it, white narcissism is actually the more accurate term for it. We see the advancement of fascism, we see the Supreme Court gutting voting rights, we see Governor Landry in Louisiana just canceling an election, throwing out tens of thousands of ballots and saying we're going to have an election whenever we decide. This is yesteryear's fascism rearing its ugly head once more. And I want you to understand that what people like Elizabeth Freeman and Robert Smalls and Muhammad Khan did were not without consequence. And this is an important note to make, because while their stories are inspiring, it's critical to understand what happened as a result. Yes, immense progress was made, but it also resulted in the reaction of what? The rise of black codes, the rise of Jim Crow, the fact that women couldn't get basic financial access till 1974, the fact that marital rape wasn't criminalized until 1993, the fact that child pornography wasn't criminalized until 1988. Right? These are all years that many of us in this room remember right now. That backlash was systemic. Right? Black codes were systemic. Everyone here has heard of the Civil Rights Acts of 1965. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Civil Rights Acts of 1875. A few people have. Most Americans don't realize that after the 13th and 14th Amendments were passed, the Civil Rights Acts of 1875 were also passed to codify them and to make sure they were enacted, make sure there was actual meaningful application. And the Supreme Court ruled 8-1, no. We know what the amendments say, that black people are human beings, but we don't actually mean that. So we're going to strip away these Civil Rights Acts. And that's where the racial segregation that set our country back another 90 years came into play and became codified. I'm going to ask another question. The KKK, this white narcissist terrorist group that emerged after the Civil War, became more and more powerful, and in the 1920s it was at its height. And I'm going to give you 3 data points, and I want you to tell me which one is the more accurate one. Because when we talk about the role that the KKK played then and now, it's often ignored. But remember, our current president's father was an active card-carrying member of the KKK. He was arrested for rioting with the KKK. He was an actual white narcissist criminal, like father, like son, I guess. But I need you guys to understand the impact that this has had. So in the 1920s, when the KKK was at its peak, I'm going to give you 3 statistics I want by raise of hand. How many white Americans were active card-carrying members of the KKK? 1 in 1,000, 1 in 500, 1 in 100. If you think it was 1 in 1,000, raise your hand. Got half a hand up. If you think it was 1 in 500, raise your hand. Okay. If you think it was 1 in 100, raise your hand. Okay, most people said 1 in 100. Again, think about the framing. I gave you bad framing. The actual answer is 1 in 11. 1 in 11 white Americans were card-carrying members of the KKK, which means that if you're white today, there's a 40% chance that at least one of your grandparents was an active card-carrying member of the KKK. These are the people who are our Supreme Court justices, who are our presidents, who are our senators, our members of Congress, our city council members. These are the people who decided in 1924 that all Asian immigration would be banned flat out. These are the people who decided the 1926 cases of Buck v. Bell that allowed castration of black people, and before those policies were finally stopped, 60,000 black Americans, men, women, and children, have been castrated in modern-day genocide while we were fighting fascists in Europe and Hitler in Europe. These are the people who, by the way, there's a phenomenal and horrifying book written by Professor, Princeton Professor Whitney, I think is his name, called Hitler's American Model, where he documents that Hitler got his horrific laws and his horrific Nuremberg laws and the concentration camps and the Holocaust ideas from where? From Jim Crow America. And this is like the very dark and painful reality is that Hitler sends his lawyers to the United States to study America's miscegenation and Jim Crow laws. And his lawyers come to the United States and they study just how horrific these laws actually are, because he wanted to apply what was done to black Americans to Jewish Germans. And Hitler's lawyers go back to him and they say, Hitler, we may be Nazis, but we are not Americans. We gotta calm down here. That's how severe the impact actually was. And it's important that Americans understand this history as well. That the genocidal fascists of Europe got his ideas from America's Jim Crow laws. Those are the same people, their descendants are the ones in power today in many respects. And it's important to acknowledge that. So I bring this up all because the framing that you're facing right now is not the imagination of your own mind. The racism, the misogyny, the economic injustices are not fabricated in your mind. These are systemic. They're designed this way. And the good news is that we can actually overcome this as well. And so what does that strategy actually look like? And I break this down to an acronym I call RISE to kind of help define the quantifiable aspect of it. Because a lot of what I've given you is history, it's knowledge, it's facts, none of it is actual solutions. I can say, yeah, work harder like Elizabeth Freeman, but what does that actually mean? And so as I read through the history of people like Elizabeth Freeman and Robert Smalls, Muhammad Khan, and the list goes on and on, right? John Brown and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, and there's so many examples throughout history that you can point to. I came up with this acronym RISE to help us define in our personal lives how we can apply this to a modern day conversation. The first one, R, you can probably guess, is reframe. Reframe the narrative. And that comes from re-educating yourselves, from relearning things that you thought were true that maybe weren't true, and reframing the conversation in a way that what does actual justice look like in this scenario? And we see why that's so important. Like, why is it that white majority schools perform better than black and Latino majority schools? The white narcissist narrative is, well, white kids are smarter. But we know that's not true. Right? From a genetic human standpoint, there's complete equality in all of us. So why? Well, the reason is because white majority schools get $20 billion more in funding every year than black and Latino majority schools. Well, then why are they getting $20 billion more in funding? Well, because the funding for schools comes from property taxes. Well, why are white homes worth so much more than black and Latino homes? Well, because after World War II, the Federal Housing Authority provided white Americans in Jim Crow America low interest or free loans and told black Americans to get lost. That's how we get redlining. And so it is safe to say that those homes that were bought for $10,000 or $15,000 60, 70 years ago that are now worth $500,000 or more created generational wealth for white families that was denied to black families. And so in our lifetimes, you want to talk about reparations and restitutions, we should go back all the way to the times of enslavement, but even if you want to talk on contemporary times, there are people alive today whose families were denied $500,000 to $1 million in wealth. This is why 25 years after graduating college, 95% of black students still have student debt, and 95% of white students have paid off their debt. It's a numbers game. And so when we look at the framing, we have to understand that this economic injustice that we're in is not by accident. So whatever the problem is, reframe the narrative. Make sure you have full context in it. The second aspect of it is identify what is specifically causing the problem. What is a specific issue that is preventing you from achieving justice? For Elizabeth Freeman, it was, well, my constitution says, my state constitution says that I'm free. The federal constitution says that I'm free, but the application of federal law is not there. But hey, hold on a second. There's this thing called states' rights that the South uses. Why can't we use the same thing as well? Massachusetts is a state. It has rights, it has sovereignty. I'm going to apply that narrative. Robert Small said the same thing. Muhammad Khan said the same thing. The list goes on and on. Identify what specifically is the issue. Once you've reframed the narrative to understand what the broader conversation is, what you're not being told, then you can identify what the actual issue is. Third one is, and this is, in my view, one of the toughest ones, because oftentimes, as you get to this point, you're going to understand that actually, maybe I don't have all the answers in front of me. And so the third one is to serve. Serve who? Serve the people doing the work. If there's somebody who's already advancing a narrative that's important to you, go and support that person. Go and serve their needs. And the example that I often give here is that right now, for example, we're seeing an all-out assault on women's rights. The so-called SAVE Act is trying to restrict women's voting. We're seeing this continued underpaying of women in the workplace. We're seeing a desecration of reproductive justice and basic healthcare access. We're seeing a complete desecration of economic and financial autonomy for women. And so for men, right, this is our problem. This is not a women's problem, it's our problem because we are the ones that are the cause of this. And if your knee-jerk reaction is, well, not me, I've never raped anybody, you don't get a cookie for that. That's the lowest possible bar. And if your first reaction is to center yourself, then you're missing the point. The men in this room, it should be our obligation. How can we serve women's organizations with our time, with our money, with our resources in a meaningful and consequential way? And then the last aspect of it is elevate. When you find the people doing the work, elevate those, use your platform to elevate those people. And this is, again, a critical component. There's one of my colleagues, and she's a phenomenal scholar, Dr. Saad Al-Kabir, has a great quote that I love, that she says, you don't need to be a voice for the voiceless, you just need to learn to pass the mic. Right? People who are marginalized are very capable of speaking for themselves. Extraordinarily capable of speaking for themselves. You can't go to somebody suffering a disability and be like, shh, let me tell everyone why you need help. It's the most patronizing and arrogant thing imaginable. So use your platform. Maybe your platform is your company. Maybe your platform is you have a position in a political power. Maybe your platform is that you have the financial means. Maybe your platform is that you can help people get to the polls. But that part is extraordinarily crucial, and it all comes back to reframing the narrative as well. So let me close with that story that I started this conversation with. So going back, again, put yourself in my shoes. You're 20-something years old. You got a wife and kid to feed. You got this offer, a 6-figure offer, that is more money than you've ever seen in your entire life. I mean, this was more than double any amount of money I had ever made in my entire life. And it was sitting right there in front of me. All I had to do was sign on the dotted line. And I would love to stand here and be like, look at how morally upright and strong I am, but I told him, go to hell. I didn't. I went to my wife and I said, hey, listen, this is gonna sting, but I think it's a pretty fair offer, because we need the money. I'm like, I don't know how we're gonna make rent this month. We had already had an episode a few months prior where our son had gotten extremely sick, and there was no kids' health care in Virginia. We rushed into the ER, and we knew the bill was going to be something like $5,000 to $6,000. And it was but for the grace of that doctor coming out and saying, I've been in medical school without health care, I'll take care of this. I mean, we were literally on the wings of angels at the time. I'm like, that can't happen again. My wife had extraordinarily complicated pregnancies, so like, we need health care. So we need the money, we need health care, and it's a good firm, I'll get good experience, we should do it. And it was my wife who said, absolutely not. Because if you cede your identity now, then this precedent that you're setting is that this type of thing is acceptable, and you're contributing. She goes, we will figure something out. And it was extraordinarily difficult next 6 months, but we did. I got a phenomenal job at another company that actually appreciated me for who I was. It was because of my better half, far better half, that I was able to have the strength, which speaks to the need of none of us can do this alone. We all need to be able to lean on one another. And history has kind of spoken for itself as well, right? At the time, I was a young father with a wonderful wife and a 2-year-old. They're still with me, they haven't left me yet. I had a beard for a couple of years, and I was very open and observant of my faith as an American Muslim. And this was one of the most powerful firms in Virginia, one of the top 200 firms in the country. Now, some 15, 16 years later, the family's still there, the family's grown, we've got 3 amazing kids now. And my social media platform that was bothering them, of about 10,000 followers, is now nearly 3 million. My dinky little podcast that had like 11 listeners, 8 of them my own family, now is a nationally syndicated Sirius XM show. And that law firm, that was one of the most powerful in the country, went bankrupt 5 years later and shut down and closed its doors forever. Because enough people said, enough of this bullcrap, we're not going to tolerate it. It takes time and it has an impact. And so I share all this because the backlash I've also gotten there has included regular death threats. I've had to testify in federal court against the men who wanted to kill me and my children. and we got him convicted, and he was out 6 months later, and we're back at it again. Right? This is the reality that we live in. So everything I'm saying to you, I don't want to make this sound kumbaya, that you're going to fight this battle and you're going to overcome and it's going to be all hunky-dory. It's going to get worse. But the reason why we do it anyway is because this is the only way it's going to get better for the next generation as well. And I always close these discussions with one of the most inspirational people that I've ever read is James Baldwin. When he talks about this, and he's asked that, he writes in The Fire Next Time, kind of observing the world that we're in. And we're talking about a gay black man in Jim Crow America. And he talks about the struggles that we're facing, and this quote, I think, just encompasses the times that we're in right now, where he says that, I know that which I ask of you is impossible. He doesn't say feels impossible. He doesn't say it's really, really hard. He doesn't say it's an uphill battle. He says, I know that which I ask of you is impossible. He acknowledges the impossibility of it. And then he continues and says, but the impossible is the least that we can demand. For when you look at the spectacle of human history in general, and black history in particular, you are emboldened by witnessing nothing less than the perpetual achievement of the impossible. And to me, that just speaks volumes about whatever trials that we're facing right now, as impossible as they feel, that's sort of the point. Right? For Elizabeth Freeman, looking at systemic enslavement and white narcissism, it felt impossible for her to gain her freedom, but she went anyway. For Robert Smalls, a young black kid, 19, 20 years old, in the throes of antebellum America, in the throes of his enslaver funding a civil war to dehumanize him even more, it felt impossible, and he escaped with his family anyway. For Muhammad Khan, somebody who didn't know the language, didn't know the culture, in military prison, it felt impossible, but they perpetuated and persisted anyway, and we see the result of that. So I ask each of you that whatever struggle you're going through, reframe the narrative, identify what specifically is holding you back, serve those doing the work, learn from them, and elevate those who are doing the work, and elevate their platforms. Don't be a voice for the voiceless. Pass the mic, and I promise you we will see meaningful change in our lifetimes. Thank you.